Good morning, guys. Day 18 of our Read Aloud. We are on chapter 3. In the last chapter, I think we had just seen Peter Nimble save Sophie Quire, but it didn't seem like she was very with him, happy with him by any means, right? She was pretty upset because at first she only had to pay a fine for taking the books, but now, after what Peter Nimble had done, now she may be part of someone who's attempted murder, so she could, or her father could end up getting arrested or even killed, right? So now we're on chapter 3, The Bookmender of Busselburg. Sophie's father was waiting for her when she finally reached the book stop. "You're late," he said, not looking up from his work. "We opened our doors half an hour ago." What if a customer had come? They both knew that this was a highly unlikely scenario given how few people set foot in their shop these days. "I'm sorry, Papa." She closed the door and removed her cloak. If her father noticed the torn hem or the mud on her apron, he chose not to say anything. "I was..." "Slowed down a bit on the way home," she said. Sophie had spent the entire journey home mulling over her encounter with the blindfolded boy. A part of her felt bad for being so ungrateful, but every time she pictured his cocky grin, she felt a new wave of anger. The boy could have gotten himself killed, and it would have been her fault. It was one thing to go read about sword fights in a story, but to see clashing blades in front of her was altogether more horrifying. She shut her eyes, trying to banish the memory from her mind, and turned back to her father. Augustus Quire sat hunched over his desk, working sums into a ledger that stubbornly refused to show a profit. "I would ask what business drew you out of bed so early, at so early an hour, but I suspect I do not want to know." He absently tried to drink from his mug of tea, which he had long since emptied. Sophie set the 3 rescued books on the counter in front of him. His pen stopped. "Again, Sophie?" He did not ask where the books had come from. He did not need to. "How many times have I warned you about this? I couldn't just leave for them there to burn." She ran a hand over a worn cover of the topmost book, the collection of St. Martin tales. It was embossed with a picture of a roaring bear. "They deserve better than the pier." Augustus removed his spectacles and massaged his temples. "You sound like your mother." This was something he often said to her, and she never quite knew if he meant it to be a compliment. Sophie's mother had died when Sophie was still an infant. The circumstances of her death were a complete mystery to Sophie, being something her father refused to discuss, so she has no idea who died. Her own mom. "It's troublesome luck to trouble the dead," he would always say, citing an old hinterland proverb. The only memento of her mother Sophie possessed was a silver necklace on which hung a round sleigh bell. The curious thing about the bell was that no matter how much Sophie shook it, it never seemed to make a sound. Sophie studied her father, who was now gazing past her to the empty workbench at the back of the shop. Augustus Quire was the sort of man who looked old beyond his years, which means that he looked even older than what he really was. His hair was thin, his movements were deliberate, and he never raised his voice. Indeed, many customers assumed he was Sophie's grandfather. That, or her master. Sophie had learned from neighbors and old customers that her father had once been quite different, an avid reader who could recite lengthy passages verbatim, or by memory, from every book he read. Sophie often tried to picture what he had been like in those days, but some things were beyond even her imagination. So does he act anything like what he used to? No, she can't even fathom it or think about it being that way. "You shouldn't worry about me, Papa," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Most of these guards can barely tie their laces." He blinked as if startled from a dream. "It is not the guards who frightened me." He replaced his spectacles. "You're a smart girl, but even smart girls can get in trouble. These are dangerous times we live in, led by dangerous men." He was, of course, speaking of Conquistador Prig. For as long as Sophie could remember, her father had feared the day when the man might direct his attention toward them. "The shop will be fine, Papa," Sophie said, inching back. "Even after Pier Day, we can just sell other kinds of books." Her father waved a hand. "I do not worry for this shop." What is the point even of a bookshop in a city that no longer reads stories? To lose this place would be a disappointment, but to lose my daughter? He fixed his eyes on her, and Sophie wondered for a moment if he had somehow learned about her capture on the bridge. That would be more than I could bear. That he might one day lose his daughter was a constant fear for Augustus Quire. His every conversation, even the smallest things, seemed to return to the subject. Sophie grabbed her father's hands in her own. She knelt, saying, as she often did when he was in this state, "I will never leave you, Papa. Never." Her father smiled, though not in a way that he had entirely believed her. "You have books to mend," he said, and returned to his work. Sophie stepped into the small inventory room, which doubled as her workshop. Stacks of scavenged books, all in various stages of disrepair, lined the floors and furniture. In a far corner sat her mother's workbench. She clasped the belt hanging from her neck, as she often did when thinking of her mother. Sophie's mother had been a bookmender named Coriander, whose work carried her to every corner of the map. How she had ended up in Busselburg, married to Sophie's father, was, like everything else about her, a mystery. Long-time customers would occasionally relate memories of her when they visited the shop. They said that she was a quiet woman, graceful in her movements, but there was a sort of sadness in her face, even when she smiled. So, how did her mother seem when most people saw her? Kind of sad, right? Sophie sat and studied the condition of the book she had saved from the pier. They had all three of them trod on during the fight on the bridge and were nearly beyond repair. Pages were torn down the middle, corners were crushed in, entire spines flattened, this is the spine of the book, and muddy boot prints embossed the covers. "Let's see what we can do," she said as she lit a lamp and set to work stripping the casing of the first book. Sophie had no formal training in book mending, but she had learned a great deal from practice and careful study of the repaired books her mother had left behind. "Welcome home," she whispered to the collection of St. Martin stories, now resting coverless atop a scratched copper plate. She gently turned the screw of her vise until the pages were secure. She removed a pot of paste and a spool of binding thread from a drawer beneath a bench and set to work repairing the spine. First, she cut the old thread from the spine and pulled apart the signatures. Then, working carefully with a brush, she cleaned dirt and grime from the cracks between the pages. "Stay calm," she said. "It'll only sting a little." She's saying that to what? The book, right? Sophie had learned long ago that books were temperamental creatures that must be coaxed back to life. A careless stitch could shift the pages and weaken the binding. Likewise, the spine would not square without proper exercise. Over time, she had discovered that the best ways to repair a book was to first know it. And so, she made a practice of reading every word of every book she repaired. It was slow going, of course, but the end result was worth it. Books she repaired were not just readable, they were transformed. The print seemed to shine brighter, the pages would lie flat, opening to just where you had stopped reading. The spine would call out to you, begging to be taken off the shelf. Not that anyone in Busselburg would ever care, but Sophie cared, and that perhaps was enough. Sophie adjusted her reading lamp and ran her fingers over the title page. Her heart beat faster, thrilling at the prospect of reading a new story. A story that might for a moment transport her beyond the walls of the bookshop to a world filled with bear kings and trickster frogs and wicked trolls and 1,000 wonders besides. She turned the page wishing that she could escape to the lands described in such stories, but no sooner did she think this than a rush of shame swept over her. She already had a home. She looked at her father, who sat hunched over his desk, scribbling in his ledger. Sophie closed her eyes and quietly renewed the promise she had made to him that day and countless days before. "I will never leave you, Papa." Even as she said this, the promise sank to the soles of her feet like an anchor plunging into cold water. Never. But what Sophie Quire did not know, what she could not know, was that her promise would very soon be broken. Tomorrow's chapter. Chapter 4. Curious Offer. Looks like that's what the front of their bookstore looks like. Quire and Quire. Got a little backstory of them. Still don't know much about her mother, right? All right, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.